I've been asked to read from two novels today, both of them about saints, and I wanted to preface that with just a word about what I understand myself the word saint to mean, or what I don't think of the word saint meaning. I do not think of the word saint as meaning a plaster saint, a kind of moral exemplar with a perpetual gentle smile on the face and feet that never quite touch the ground, the kind of person from whose presence I think we'd all run shrieking away if we ever should encounter such a person. I mean a real person, as you and I are real, with plenty of shadows and plenty of neuroses and plenty of abysses and feet made very much of clay, through whom, nonetheless, by the grace of God, something of the power of God moves. The Holy Spirit, thought of as the Lord and giver of life. And I think of saints as men and women who themselves are life givers in some way, to be in the presence of whom is, to a degree, to be brought more to life than ever was possible before. People whose lives are transparent from time to time, not all the time, but from time to something holy behind, within their lives. I think the saint that I met in literature that made the most impression on me, I have at least to mention to you, and that is the figure of the whiskey priest in Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory, which I hope, if you haven't read, you'll find time someday to read. A seedy little joke of a priest, an alcoholic, a physical coward, the father of an illegitimate child, who nonetheless finds himself the last priest left in the revolutionary Mexico of the 1930s, the only one who hasn't either given up his faith and gotten married, which is what they were forced to do, or who hasn't been shot. And he's on the run through the jungle, one jump ahead of the sheriff, so to speak, the revolutionary officials, and has so much about him that is the last thing we'd think of as saintly, but who nonetheless keeps the guttering flame of the faith in a fashion alive, and touches the lives of the people with whom he comes in contact in ways that, curious ways, subterranean ways, but significant ways, turns them to a greater life, a deeper life within themselves. And then, of course, we all also have met our own saints, I think. If you look back on your life, people who touched you for good, often without intending to do so. And often people who didn't seem all that important at the time, but whom you look back upon and realize were, for you in a way, saints. A nurse, a babysitter, a teacher, an old aunt, who knows who they might be. But they're there for all of us. And maybe from time to time we're given also to be saints ourselves. And I remember one book I wrote, I dedicated to a man I didn't know all that well, who had been at a dark time for me, a kind of saint for me, and I dedicated to him, and then said, for him and for all the other saints, known and unknown, remembered and forgotten, whom we all have in our lives. I want to read you about two saints today. The first of them, not the first book I wrote, but the one who came first in history, an Irish saint named Brendan, known as Brendan the Navigator, who was born, as I remember, somewhere around the end of the 5th century and lived, as many of them seem to have done in those days, with a great old age of 90 or so. He was famous particularly for the voyages he took. He had the idea that paradise, Tir na Nog, as they called it, the land of perpetual youth, was somewhere out on the Western Sea. And he set forth with a few friends, monks, in one of those little banana-shaped boats with wicker hulls and leather around it, keep it watertight, in search of paradise, and never found it, but had many extraordinary adventures on the way, which were incorporated ultimately into a very long and colorful legend, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, and was one of the great medieval bestsellers, apparently. Everybody knew it. And buried beneath the highly legendary account, there is no question, fact also. There was such a man, he did such a thing. And he lived in Ireland, as I say, in the 5th and 6th centuries. And as I read into that period, which I didn't do in any great depth, because I'm not basically a historical novelist, history is not my interest so much as the people, I came to discover that Ireland in that time was a kind of oasis in Europe. The Dark Ages were happening on the continent, and the barbarian hordes had little by little eaten away at the power of Rome. The Romans had pulled out of Great Britain, and they were being invaded also. Chaos and darkness and confusion. But Ireland was this little green jewel where learning flourished. Greek and Latin were taught, and the Book of Kells was illuminated, and beautiful jewels were made. And as I understand it, at least, Christianity in many ways swept with St. Patrick the century before like a warm breeze, meeting little opposition, lots of old gods, lots of druids, but no martyrdoms, no massacres. They loved it in many ways from the beginning. But nonetheless, the old gods were indeed still present, and the old druids and so on. And one of the things that Brendan did when he wasn't taking these extraordinary voyages was to convert from the old faith to the new one. And I thought I'd begin by reading you a scene in which he works a kind of conversion, at least, upon a group that he comes upon. He and his friend Finn, the narrator, who speaks a kind of demotic English, not very grammatical, are on their way to the crowning of the High King at Cashel, which was the capital of Southern Ireland, this great rock. Brendan is a sort of a gangly man with a big rump, narrow shoulders, kind of pointed head, red hair, mouth with many too many teeth in it. And Finn is his friend. So here's a description of what happened to them as they wended their way. They were on their way to Cashel, and as they walked through the woods, they were suddenly come upon by a group of ragged men with spears, the little army of some tribal king. And Finn, the friend, is the one who describes it. After a time, we started climbing a hill. The trees thinned out some as we went. There was brambles snagging at our cloaks. Brendan was puffing along at my side, and I had a stitch in my ribs, but the leader never so much as broke his stride till we got to the top at last. It was a bald, high knob you could see the other hills from. We was well above the mist there. It was drifting in the deep glens all about us like sea. There was a ring of tall, standing stones hard by. In the center was another stone. It was stouter and squatter than the others, and around the base of it all manner of twining leaves and stems that must have been carved in it in ancient times by the look of them. The top of it was rounded off, sleek, and there was a kind of collar about it, like a man's part. An old fat man with a gold torque about his neck sat on a slab alongside it. He had gold earrings looped over his ears and a garnet brooch for holding his cloak together. On his head was a greasy, soft cap. There was a meager fire of twigs at his feet to keep off the damp. The spears scattered themselves about, each picking a tall stone to stand behind, still as stones. The spearman nodded to Brendan and me to step into the ring. The man on the slab looked up and down with only his small eyes traveling. He was clean-shaved like the one that brought us, and there was a look to him made me wonder, was they father and son, though the old one was fat as the other was spare, with a great tumbled, sad face on him. He took a pull from his pot of beer on the sod next him and let it trickle down his chin. "I'm king," he said at last. "I'm Brendan, son of Finlogue," Brendan said. "This here is my friend Finn. We're men of peace, the two of us. We're bound for the making of the High King at Cashel." "Let them make what they can," the king said. "I can't even make water anymore, not more than a drop at a time anyhow. Besides that, it seems like my knees bend the wrong way when I walk. I need 2 sticks to manage." He waved at a pair of forked ash plants leaning against the lewd stone. He held his 2 hands out in front of him so that we could see them better. They was covered in rings. "Each of these rings is for a king I killed in battle," he said. He lowered his hands and gave a belch. Nowadays, I need a man under each arm to set me on my feet. Then I have to wait till my head stops spinning, or as soon as I start walking, I tumble in a heap. I'm grieved to hear it, Brendan said. The great Bishop Irk, that's my shield and lord, always holds there's nothing for stiffness in the joints like seawater. I tried it, the king said. I've eat all manner of foul herbs. I've soaked in comfrey. I've had my druids switch me from head to toe with yew wands and daub me with muck like I was wattles. I've slit throats galore to him of the silver arm. He winced like something was sticking him. Nor was all the throats I slit beasts' throats either. The gray clouds scudded low over our heads. The king shifted from one buttock to the other and groaned. The bullies leapt out with their spears at the ready and would have spit at us on the spot if the king hadn't waved them back. Brendan stood steady as a tree with his damp beard hanging in wisps. Perhaps I can tell you something new to try, Boheen, he said. The king's eyes widened. How come you know my name? He said. It's no matter, Brendan said. The king kept his eyes on him a long time. Before lowering them, he set his cap beside him on the slab and kneaded his brow with his hand. It made his eyebrows tilt and muddle. Time was there wasn't the likes of Boheen to be found in the whole land, the king said, like a man talking in a dream. We'd stand on the hilltop and rouse the beasts in the glens, hurling clods and hollering. We'd blow ourselves black in the face on our horns. There was the red deer and the wild swine and the fawns all running mad in the bracken. We'd run down on them madder still, Boheen in front with his blue spear. Each had a leash of hounds, and such was their fury the earth was red when we was done. Not a boar was left, puffing slobber through his snout. It might be upwards of 1,000 deer fallen, and the great stags belling after their dead does. Neither the hinds nor the badgers could be counted, there were such a heaps of them, nor the clubbed conies. Light on my feet, as a lovely girl I was then, though strong as a red ox. He took another pull on his beer, looking at us over the edge of his pot. And Fiona, Brendan said. You'll not be leaving out Fiona, surely. The king choked. Beer shot from his mouth and run down out of his nose. He threw his two arms in the air and bent over, coughing and spewing. His eyes started out of his head like berries on stems. I would have thumped him between the shoulders, only I was scared the spears would be upon me. He stopped finally. His face was blotched. There was tears running down. You must be a wizard, he said. His voice was scarce more than a whisper. It's little enough, Brendan said. Bright as a star, Fiona was, Boheen said. She had shaggy gray legs and a white belly on her, soft as pin feathers. She could course swift as the wind and fetch down a stag without a mark on him. He mopped his face with his cap. I had them slay me a king when Fiona died, he said. I had her laid in her grave with a slayed king at her 4 great feet in honor. It was more of a drizzling than a misting now. The squat stone glistened. Boheen had forgot we was there, it seemed. His eyes was closed to where you could see little but the whites of them under the lids. Who would you be then? He asked at last, opening his eyes. I'm Christ's man, Brendan said. Whoever that might be, Boheen said. How come you make so free, gadding through my lands like a harper? I'd take you for a bog man from the looks of you. I make old things, good as new, Brendan said. Ah, you're a tinker then, Boheen said.